Although the traffic between Crisfield and Salisbury had been thin, at the airport the parking lot was overflowing. There were 3 Maryland State Police cars and 8 or 9 policemen, but they seemed unclear about what they were supposed to be doing. Inside the drab terminal, people were strangely quiet. The room was crowded, but what little movement there was slowed down, as if everyone was moving through molasses. As Frank walked directly toward the door-marked manager's office, he had to push his way through 2 long lines that stretched far out into the room from the ticket counter. "I want to buy or charter a plane," he said to the small, spare man seated at the desk who invited him in when he knocked. After looking at Frank for a moment, the man frowned down at the papers he'd been going through. "All the regular charter planes are filled," he said. "There are also 20 or 30 private planes operating out of this airport, and a few are unofficially selling seats to passengers. The going rate is $5,000 a seat." "Any of them going to New York?" Frank asked eagerly. "None going north," the manager replied. "Most are going to the Bahamas or the West Indies. 1 or 2 of the bigger ones to South America." "Then I want to buy a plane and hire a pilot." "No one will fly you to New York." "Money talks," said Frank. "Not very loudly as far as heading north is concerned," the manager squinted up at Frank. "May I ask why you're so hot to get to what's left of New York?" he asked. "Family." "Ah," the manager said and shook his head. "Well, I can't help you. The private planes are housed in C&D hangars at the west end of the field. If someone wants to sell a plane, that's where they'd be." When Frank got to Hangar C, he came upon a flurry of activity. 2 small planes being worked on, one being pushed out of the hangar, and 3 or 4 clusters of people talking. Frank began asking people who might sell him a plane to fly north. "There's only one guy here I know of who said he'd let his plane go north if the money was right," one man said, "and that's Tommy Trainer over in Hangar D." "How'll I find him?" Frank asked. "Little guy, wears a natty white suit," the man answered. "He owns the 2-engine Beechcraft over at the back corner. But, buddy, you don't think you're going to make it north and back through what's happening up there, do you?" Frank wheeled and headed off towards Hangar D. Tommy Trainer was a flashily dressed little man with the dark, slick-down hair and an absurdly large cigar. He was checking his Beechcraft with a mechanic when Frank found him. After listening to Frank explain what he wanted to do, the little man just continued to stare at him and chewed lightly on his unlit cigar. "Well, sir," he said with a dignified drawl of a southern gentleman, completely at variance with his bookkeeper's appearance, "I'd like to help you, I really would, but I believe the general opinion is that it's dangerous travelling north these days. I believe there's just a bit of risk involved. Would you agree, sir?" "A lot of risk," Frank said. "I'll pay accordingly." "That's right generous of you, sir, and I appreciate it. I'll tell you what," he continued in southern drawl, "I can't charter you my plane 'cause the insurance don't cover it, you know, but I'll sell you the plane, let's see, $100,000. How does that sound, sir? What about a pilot?" "I believe I might be able to pay a pilot for another 20. Frank, who sometimes quibbled over the price of a 25-cent sinker, felt a flash of anger. The beat-up plane couldn't be worth more than $25,000, and the pilot would be doing at most half a day's work. "It's a deal," he said. "In cash, gold, or silver?" said Tommy Trainer. Frank frowned. His forward momentum checked. He looked at Tommy Trainer. Where the hell could he get the money? "Where's the nearest bank?" Frank finally asked. "Bank?" Tommy Trainer exclaimed. "It's a little late for banks, I'm afraid." Frank stared at him uncertainly. "I'll be back," he said. On the short drive from the airport into Salisbury, Frank realised that it wasn't going to work. He needed a plane this instant, and the banking system, even at the best of times, was not used to producing $120,000 in an instant. In these times, the situation turned out to be worse than he imagined. Most of the banks hadn't even opened. The 2 that had were mobbed, with long lines outside the doors, and he realised, of course, that there were no phone or teletype contact with either of his New York City banks, nor his bank in Oyster Bay. "They're not doing any banking business with anybody except their regular customers," a man told Frank. "I doubt there's a single bank in the country." Defeated, Frank returned to his car and sat slumped in shock. He might be able to steal the plane, he thought, pay for it later, but he couldn't fly it. He supposed he could kidnap a pilot, but generally he realised that was no way. He couldn't get there by car, he couldn't fly, he was stuck. As he slowly drove back to Crisfield, he felt disorientated by the succeeding shocks of the day. All his life he'd been a doer, a man who faced problems squarely and set about solving them. His success in the world of New York City real estate was based partly on his ability to deal with problems as soon as they arose, to make fast decisions, and to get the job done. It also helped that he wasn't afraid of risks. He enjoyed taking risks. He wanted to treat the unthinkable catastrophe of nuclear war as he would of an emergency cash flow problem, for the challenge of the war stimulated him. The logistical challenge of rescuing his wife, retrieving his financial position, surviving, all these got his adrenaline flowing, and he had acted decisively, rationally and quickly. But the experience he'd had in the 3 hours in Salisbury represented for him the psychological equivalent of being bombed. He began to realise that all his paper wealth, his stocks, bonds, mutual funds, treasury certificates, were probably worthless. And the tangible assets he owned, the apartment homes in New York City, his home in Oyster Bay, the shopping centre in Englewood, had all, with the hopeful exception of his house in Oyster Bay, been destroyed. But worse, he realised that the problems and the challenges presented by the Holocaust were not something he could deal with. He couldn't buy a plane or a car or even maybe a tank of gasoline. He couldn't even telephone anyone. He was almost helpless. Suddenly, overnight, he was an unemployed pauper. But a live pauper. As he drove back towards Chrisfield with the car radio tuned to the appalling news, cities with which all communication had been lost, countries with which all communication had been lost, a large part of him began to fear for his life and wanted to scurry for the nearest hole. The numbing, incomprehensible, dreamlike list of American cities and defence installations that had been struck by nuclear missiles or bombs dazed him. He heard the Secretary of Defence urging people to stick to their jobs if their jobs were important, to report for service if they weren't. In one sentence, the Secretary warned against needless panic, and another advised people to evacuate contaminated areas. He didn't mention any by name. Frank learned that the United States bombed Cuba, and that Europe was being devastated. London wiped out, Moscow, Leningrad, numerous other unpronounceable Russian cities. Russian forces in Iraq had been attacked. China and Japan had been hit. Several countries in South America and Africa had loudly proclaimed their neutrality. His fear for himself began to grow. He knew that part of his frantic activity to get up north to his wife was based on the simple fact that it was the expected thing to do. It was a man's job to protect his wife. The thought of her there in their house, helpless and confused, worried about Jimmy, worried about him too, huddled together with Susan. That thought made him sad, made him feel needed, made him want to find a way north. But the only thing left now was Vagabond. He was frightened. He pressed his foot down on the accelerator. All hope of salvation lay with the Vagabond.